Good evening. This is the digital age, and I'm Jim Zirin. Secretary of State Clinton wants to harness the internet to further the objectives of American foreign policy, freedom and democracy. Our guest tonight takes a contrarian view. He sees the internet as an instrumentality used by repressive regimes to crack down on dissidents. So, what is this internet? Is it a techno-utopia or is it a digital dictatorship? Here to discuss this issue with us is Evgeny Morozov. Evgeny Morozov teaches at Georgetown and is a seminal thinker on political implications of the internet. He recently wrote a full-page, thought-provoking op-ed which appeared in the Wall Street Journal, in which he dealt with this precise question. Evgeny, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, delighted to have you. To kick things off, is Hillary a techno-utopian? You coined the term.
Actually, I didn't coin the term. I think there has been a lot of fascination with what technology can help us accomplish throughout history. You know, people looked at the radio, people looked at the telegraph with a lot of high expectations as to how they can usher in the world peace. For example, there has been a lot of enthusiasm about the telegraph. And now I think a lot of that enthusiasm is also palpable when it comes to issues like blogging or social networking or things like Twitter. And I do think that there is a certain degree of cyber-utopianism and techno-utopianism, if you will, in Secretary Clinton's thinking, particularly in her recent speech about internet freedom.
Well, the idea is, I suppose, that Twitter and Facebook will help dissidents organize and exchange ideas and will eventually bring about reform in places like Iran. Mm-hmm. Do you agree with that logic?
Well, yes, you can certainly, and I do agree with that logic. It's just that there are a lot of other hidden costs which are not necessarily obvious to us sitting in the West, you know, and thinking that the internet is only for the dissidents or for the young people to play around and to topple the regimes. As it turns out, the regimes themselves are actually very active users of those technologies, whether it is to actually map out who the dissidents are and see how they're connected to each other, which now has become very easy to do thanks to Facebook, which organizes all of the data for the regimes. They don't even have to do any of the, you know, drawing boards. All of that is automatically presented to them through Facebook. Or alternatively for propaganda purposes, for trying to push their talking points through anonymous bloggers, or by trying to upload, you know, fake videos or fake tweets, which will then split the oppositional movements, as also happened in Iran.
Well, policy wonks in the West, and certainly statesmen, kind of see the net as a great hope. I mean, Nicholas Negroponte argues that blogger argues the net will demolish the nation state. Gordon Brown says, Prime Minister of England, that we should listen to bloggers before we elaborate foreign policy. Are these examples of cyber-utopians?
I would say so. Again, we did see Nicholas Negroponte writing a very popular book called Being Digital in the mid-90s, where he actually predicted the demise of the nation state and that there will be as much room for nationalism in this world as there is for smallpox, for example, right? And of course, none of that has played out, as we are beginning to see some nationalist communities have actually become much stronger because of the internet, because they manage to find each other online, because they have access to various materials which perpetuate their myth. You know, it was very hard to go and find a book that would deny, you know, the Armenian Holocaust, the Armenian genocide, or, you know, the Holocaust, or, you know, hunger in Ukraine in the 1930s. Now, all of those books have been digitized, put online, and there are a lot of nationalistically minded folks who actually are finding those books and then are propagating many of the myths around us, right? So again, this vision of the internet as the cosmopolitan, you know, new cosmopolitan paradise where people will transcend all borders and be very tolerant, I think that's just very premature.
Well, I want to get back to how regimes use the net in order to repress dissidents. I mean, you wrote, I guess you spoke recently in England, you said, and I quote, "In the past, it would take weeks, if not months, to identify how Iranian activists connect with each other. Now you know how they connect to each other by looking at Facebook page. KGB, not just KGB, used to torture to get this data, now all available online." So now, is that a little exaggerated, or did the KGB used to torture people to get the information that's readily available on a Facebook page?
Well, they certainly did use to torture people, so I'm sure that part is not overstated. When it comes to what they can actually learn from the internet about the nature of dissent and the directions where dissent is coming from, I think it's quite a lot. You can look at, for example, Twitter and try to do word analysis. You can actually see which terms are being used. And now that Twitter also has locational data, you can actually see where people are tweeting from. So you can actually map various political sentiments and feelings against the geographic location, which again is something which turns entire nations into giant focus groups, where all you have to do is just to sit and watch this data in real time and then make adjustments and make sure that you actually act preemptively. Again, we tend to forget that one of the reasons that the Soviet Empire collapsed was because it just had inferior information about what was going on in their country and then, in the region as a whole, right? They really were not sure as to the nature of the popular sentiment at that point.
So you think if there'd been Twitter and Facebook, we might still have a Soviet Union?
And I think we might still have the Berlin Wall. If the Germans were all on Twitter tweeting how much they hate the regime would have known how really unpopular it is and would have taken measures much sooner. Again, I think we have to be aware of the power that this information also gives to the regimes themselves.
Well, so that when you go on Twitter or you go on Facebook, in a sense, you're spying on yourself.
Yes, and you join groups. Again, I, as someone who works in this area and who comes from, Belarus, which is more or less still an authoritarian country, perhaps the only one in Eastern Europe, I actually know that a lot of dissidents and a lot of people who are involved in democratic, positional politics see nothing wrong with connecting with their Western funders or Western supporters on Facebook. And this creates all sorts of curious situations where, that actually gives evidence that there is foreign support coming to these dissidents because, well, they are connected on Facebook. Why else would someone in Washington, D.C. be connected to some random activist in, provincial Belarus or Iran or China for that matter? So, yes, we are creating a lot of that evidence ourselves.
You've used the term in the past, spinnernet. Is that a term you coined?
This is a term I coined, yes,
term you
finally.
Coined. Yes, finally. Now, what is spinnernet? Tell us about it.
In my research on how authoritarian governments themselves using the internet, I've been really fascinated by how they have embraced it for propaganda purposes. So you look at a country like China, and the Chinese government actually trains and pays close to 280,000 people who then go online, identify politically sensitive discussions, and then start arguing, trying to push the government messages to other bloggers. Right? So they are called 50 Cent Party. And 50 Cent here stands for how much money they get paid for each comment, pro-government comment, of course, that they leave on the internet. In Russia, it takes a slightly different form. Instead of this very distributed network of almost 300,000 contributors, they have a handful of people they really trust, who then run their own new media startups, who are creating their own propaganda. So they're creating, social networks, they're creating their own political websites, but it's all done through a handful of trusted operators. In Iran, it's
propaganda.com.
Yes. So, we are, in some sense, beginning to see this, very comfortable marriage between spin on the one hand and the internet. So, hence the spinternet.
Let's just go back to Iran and the demonstrations of the Green Movement that they recently had. There appeared on Iranian television images of the supreme ruler Ayatollah Ali his photograph being burned in effigy. Now, there's reason to believe that those were not by protesters. Now, there's reason to believe that that was really not an authentic photograph, and it was used by the regime to divide the protesters.
Well, that's one of the tricks, which again is very common.
Disinformation.
Yes, but also with this woman Neda, who was shot in Iran and became a symbol of the Iranian opposition. The Iranian government actually made a number of documentaries which tried to argue that she actually wasn't shot, that she died on her way to the hospital, and that it was actually staged in order, to garner support in the West. So they are very active, even the facts which are very hard to deny, like the death of this woman, they are trying to spin them, and they are also trying to spin them in order to split the movement. Because if one part of the movement sees that another part is burning, portraits of the supreme leader, of course it raises a lot of questions. And sometimes it does go through television, often it goes through YouTube and social networking sites. So no one really knows how much you can trust this and who made that video. So people spend a lot of time in doubt trying to investigate whether they're actually authentic or not.
But the State Department is certainly relying heavily on the new media. At the time of the demonstrations in Iran, they asked Twitter to defer a scheduled maintenance program presumably so that dissidents and members of the Green Movement could tweet each other.
Well, they did, yes.
And which they did.
And I think the logic here was exactly what you said. It was to make sure that people inside Iran can continue communicating. Again, it's a logic that has not yet been quantified.
But you've argued that there's a downside to this because it makes it appear that Twitter is a tool of the United States government. I mean, this is what you wrote on the subject. You said it is certainly a good thing that Obama's youthful bureaucrats have bonded with the brightest creative minds of Silicon Valley. However, the kind of message that it sends the rest of the world, i.e. that Google, Facebook, and Twitter are now just extensions of the U.S. State Department, may simply endanger the lives of those who use such services in authoritarian countries.
Sure.
Now, if regimes crack down on Facebook in its entirety, or on political Facebook users, they run the risk, just single out Facebook, they run the risk that social users of the site will be angered against the regime because their favorite networking site no longer exists. So there's a risk in that, isn't there?
Sure. Let me try to unpack this because there are several layers here. Yes, if we had 15 million Iranians who were all very actively communicating on Twitter, and the State Department was absolutely sure that if Twitter goes down, then all those people wouldn't be able to communicate, I would see a lot of logic to them reaching out to the Twitter founders and asking them to actually delay their maintenance. What actually happened is that we are not sure that there were millions or even hundreds of Iranians on Twitter. Al Jazeera tried to do fact-checking during the protests to verify how many people were actually on the ground in Twitter in Iran and how many of them are twittering. And they could only locate 60 accounts. And that number fell actually to 6 once authorities started cracking down on communications. A lot of twittering was done by Iranians in the diaspora, those who were not in Iran and those who were sympathizing with Iran from the outside. So given that, I find it really troubling that the American government actually endorsed the use of Twitter for such political uses because it creates a lot of very uncomfortable links, which then the Iranian government and the Chinese government also are exploiting for their own purposes. And they say that, it was you who funded Twitter and who asked Twitter to stay active because that's how you wanted to ferment another revolution in Iran.
Yes, let's move on to China. In January, Hillary Clinton said she thought it was the policy of the United States to have a single internet. And it was the cornerstone of her foreign policy agenda. Now, you read the statement. I mean, she kind of brought American foreign policy into the digital age. And she said that there ought to be an investigation of China's attacks on Google, or Chinese-based attacks on Google, which was doing business in China, and which had said it would no longer filter search requests. What do you make of all that?
Well, I think, again, it's very hard to put the internet ahead of other foreign policy interests that the United States has, because trying to campaign on behalf of a single internet means that we do want to have democracy and strong freedom of expression laws and, First Amendment everywhere. And we know that that's simply not going to happen. It's not going to happen in countries like Egypt or countries like Jordan, where we do have legitimate interests, and we are not going to simply, abandon people we have been supporting there for decades in order to promote rule of law. Right? That's just not going to happen, whether it is a matter of tweets or a matter of blogs or a matter of social networks. So it was actually very interesting that in the same week that Hillary Clinton made her internet freedom speech, Jordan announced a new internet censorship law, which Hillary Clinton didn't at all mention in the speech. So I think a lot of that will just be a continuation of politics as usual, and trying to figure out which states are more conducive to American foreign policy interests and which are less, and then trying to see how the internet would fit. But I don't think that they would be able to convince the Chinese government that they should stop censoring and they should stop filtering, because the Chinese have, as they think, legitimate interests, and frankly speaking, the kind of movements that are happening in this space in Western Europe or in countries like Australia, which are beginning to censor and filter the internet much heavily, actually play to China's advantage, because they point their finger at Australia, at France, at Germany, at Britain, who are also now beginning to censor the weapons. They say, well, everyone is doing it, everyone has an interest, why can't we do it?
Well, about 5 years ago, Google, although its management was divided over the issue, decided to enter China. They formed Google.cn, the Chinese operation. And China doesn't actually censor, am I correct? They rely on the companies doing business there as a condition of doing business to filter. And that was the deal that Google made. Now Google said they don't want to filter anymore, and that preceded quite closely the attacks, the hacks on Gmail, particularly dissidents who happen to have Gmail accounts. Now, did Google make a mistake in going into China in the first place?
Well, I think they didn't make a mistake. However, they should have been more cautious and more realistic as to what to expect from the Chinese government. They thought that they have entered a deal where the Chinese government would stick to their part of the contract and would leave Google alone, to make money and, capitalize on the most profitable market in the world.
They have 36% of the market share there.
Yes, but there are new services. They are very active in the music business, for example, in China, whereas they're not really active in the music business elsewhere. They had a lot of hopes for their new mobile phone, which could be sold in China. But I think the bottom line is that the Chinese government itself does not have a very fixed, coherent strategy when it comes to controlling the internet, because the internet itself is in flux. New services keep appearing, people find different ways to organize, and the Chinese government always has to find new ways to control them. So, every month they have been imposing new demands on Google. And I think at some point, particularly when the cyber attacks happened, I think Google just ran out of patience and they said it's enough. We either want to get the US government behind us and try to frame it as a political issue to gain more grounds in negotiating, or we'll just exit China altogether.
In your view, is the flap a commercial issue, a human rights issue, or a national security issue for the United States?
For the United States, well, I think there is definitely this layer of espionage where, yes, Google does traffic into a lot of sensitive data because it runs the most popular email service in the world. And that will continue no matter what, whether they are in China, whether they cease operations there completely. So I think that espionage layer will be there forever. In terms of human rights issue, it's very hard to say. Again, you look at Google in India, where also there are a lot of laws, and Google actually runs a very popular social network in India called Orkut, where they do censor heavily. And a lot of people working on freedom of expression in India actually accuse Google of censoring much more heavily in India than some of the Indian newspapers do, right? Because they just want to make sure that they don't break any laws. And I guess it all boils down to how to interpret the local laws.
Or whose ox is being gored. Now, Evgeny, you have quite a gift for political satire, and in a London speech, you recently brought down the house with this one, which I wanted to share with our viewers. This is what you said.
But I think the biggest conceptual pitfall that cyber-utopians made is when it comes to digital natives, people who have grown up online. We often hear about cyber activism, how people are getting more active because of the internet. We rarely hear about cyber hedonism, for example, right? How people are becoming passive. Why? Because we somehow assume that the internet is going to be the catalyst of change that will push young people into the streets, while in fact it may actually be the new opium for the masses, which will keep the same people in their rooms downloading pornography.
Now, do you believe that the internet is going to become the new opium for the masses, which will keep the same people in their rooms downloading pornography, or were you just being provocative?
No, I think it's definitely an option. And I think, again, when we talk about the role that the internet plays in authoritarian states, we tend to forget our own national discourse about the internet. When we talk about the internet in the context of the United States, we do raise concerns whether, Google making us stupid, whether young people are getting politically disengaged, whether they are reading less and less political news. There is a very rich debate about the social and political implications of the internet, and a lot of people are voicing legitimate concerns. When we try to transpose that debate to a country like China or Iran, we completely forget about this negative social and political concerns that we are raising in our own context and think that the only role for the internet in China would be to liberate people and make them read reports from Human Rights Watch and download them every day instead of downloading films, clips, and yes, pornography. But that's what also happens on our own internet, right?
So maybe they prefer pornography to Human Rights Watch.
I think that's a legitimate thing to say, yes. That's just how interests work, and that's, the problem in countries like China or Iran is a lack of strong civil society and any kind of political culture. And you can't build that political culture just by letting people do whatever they want online, because chances are they may actually run away from that political culture altogether, and they'll be much harder to reach for exactly those dissidents that we are so concerned about.
Or Chinese may feel that if there were a free and open internet, a single internet, which is what Secretary Clinton wants to see, that what they're being exposed to is simply anti-China propaganda generated by the United States or someone else, and they won't be interested.
I think so, again, because a lot of media consumption still happens through traditional media, who do still play a significant role, and those are, to some degree, still controlled in China, and they do manufacture a lot of pro-government messages. So there is this culture of suspicion. And again, I think the more Google strikes deals with the National Security Agency, the more concerns people in China and Iran will have about what actually is the role that Google is playing in all of this, and I think some of those concerns are legitimate.
Now, suppose Google pulls out of China. Do you think they will still be exposed to cyber attacks that are Chinese-based?
For sure. Because, again, the reason for cyber attacks is not the fact that Google is not censoring enough. The reason for cyber attacks is because they have become a repository of sensitive emails from all over the world because they simply offer the most reliable email service, which is commercially and available for free. Right?
Well, there were other U.S. companies that were attacked as well, some of them that didn't even do business in China at or about the same time, isn't that right?
Sure, but again, we don't know whether it was part of the same attack, whether it was separate groups. It's very hard to say whether those attacks actually had anything in common. But again, it was done, as far as I can understand, for espionage reasons. Right? It's stealing sensitive data, then trying to sell it. In the case of the Chinese dissidents, it was stealing their data. Again, we don't know if any of the private emails of American diplomats were also targeted, right? They just didn't come out, but it may as well be the case.
Yes, and we don't even know that it was the Chinese government that launched these attacks. There may have been private interests in China that wanted to steal intellectual property, isn't that right?
Yes, and again, it looks that the attacks were actually not very sophisticated. They targeted particular employees who were working for Google China, and it seems that someone was just really doing some diligent intelligence, and they knew what are the kind of emails that those people are likely to open and click on links. It's social engineering.
Yes. Evgeny Morozov, we have to wrap up, and I have a question for you. Are we heading for a techno-utopia or a digital dictatorship?
Well, I think we already live in Techno-Utopia, so I think we're already there. But again, I think those two are not mutually exclusive. So yes, the governments will continue doing their evil thing, while we will continue thinking that everything is rosy and we shouldn't be concerned.
Evgeny Morozov, thank you so much for coming by. That was perfectly wonderful.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you for coming by. Tune in next week for more on the digital age. For the digital age, I'm Jim Zirin. Good night and all the best.